Hello again, Michele here from LawRoom. It's now 11 a.m., so as planned, we will be kicking off the event. Today we will come at a hard stop at 12 p.m. PST. That will be 3 p.m. for the East Coast folks. Since we'll be tackling a big topic today, we decided to dedicate a full hour to this discussion. So big thanks to all of you for freeing up your calendars and to be with us here today. I just wanted to mention a couple housekeeping items before we start. You'll notice there is a speech bubble with a question mark inside at the right-hand side of your screen. That's the place where you can click and type in your questions. We will select a handful of them that we will answer at the end of this presentation. And given the high number of attendees today, we probably won't have time to answer all of them, but please, by all means, put them there. And if anything, we'll try to find a way to get back to you on them. The presentation slide deck, so that we will be using, will be made available as a handout at the end of this event. So you'll see the document icon light up just below the question box, and you'll be able to click and download that so you can keep the slides for future reference. Now, without further ado, let's get started with today's event. Title is Lessons Learned on Anti-Harassment in 2016. So the reason we chose this topic is that, as you probably know, this past June, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission published a report that revealed just how much harassment in the workplace still remains a major source of liability for employers. In financial year 2015 alone, as we can read in the report, harassment complaints resulted in a staggering 164.5 million in EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, recoveries. So significantly also, almost half of these complaints coming from the private sector were actually based on sexual harassment grounds. Presenting on this topic today is our own Steve Treagus. Steve earned his JD from John F. Kennedy University Law School and his BA from Sonoma State University. And after a number of years in employment law, private practice, Steve joined LawRoom and is now a legal editor for us. He writes courses, he monitors litigation, he monitors legal updates, and also publishes awesome blog posts on our blog in the, obviously, employment law and compliance domain. So thank you, Steve, for being with us today. And why don't you bring us just into the topic?
Thank you so much, Michele, for the very nice introduction. I learned a lot about myself just now. And so let's get started. As Michele said, we're doing lessons learned on workplace harassment in 2016, which I've subtitled How to Go Beyond Training, Combat Harassment, and Keep Your Footing in Today's Shifting Legal Landscape. So we're going to have three main sections here. First of all is going to be the introduction to the report, and second will be harassment today, scope of the problem, and third will be an exploration of strategies and best practices for preventing harassment. So we're going to be looking through the lens of the Equal Opportunity Commission report, which I'm going to, when I talk about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from now on, I'm going to call them the EEOC. We're also going to look at contemporary studies and current case law, and we're going to provide a sweeping look at what harassment in the workplace can teach us. So first of all, the EEOC report. What that report calls for is us to take a hard look at the last 30 years of anti-harassment efforts, to sharpen our focus on company culture, to make sure that there's leadership and accountability on all levels of your organization, and to take novel approaches to rooting out workplace harassment. So the EEOC recommends a reboot. They say we now call for a reboot of workplace harassment prevention efforts. So the report was on June the 20th, 2016, so it's really recent. You can look it up. We have a link there where it says EEOC Select Task Force published a report. And that report reveals why harassment in the workplace is still a major source of liability and proposes some new ways of addressing it. So, 30 years and counting. The report recommends a reboot because It's been more than 30 years since the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that not only is sex discrimination under Title VII legally actionable, but sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. The argument in that case was that a boss having a sexual relationship with an employee was consensual. That's what the employer said. And the Supreme Court said not necessarily, because he has a certain amount of power. You have to look deeply into the facts, and it could be sex discrimination. And so a whole new wave of possible liability was born and continues to this day. So today, harassment can be based on protected characteristics, and it's still a big part of today's workplace. And finally, our traditional approaches ever since that Supreme Court ruling have not been working. Those approaches have been based solely on preventing legal liability and simply on training, but we've got to do more. So here's the report in a nutshell. Basically, the EEOC is telling us that legal action and training aren't enough. Alone, they cannot stop harassment. They're also telling us that harassment starts with a culture that tolerates or encourages misconduct, and that misconduct needs to be addressed before it rises to harassment. So before it becomes legally actionable, there are many things that employers can do. Training can be an effective anti-harassment tool, but it's got to be part of a holistic harassment prevention effort by each organization. And finally, a holistic prevention effort does start with leadership at the top, but it requires systems. It requires accountability for everyone at the organization, from the CEO down to the janitor. Up next, we're going to unpack what the report says about the prevalence of harassment today and supplement it with our own research. So this is part two, where we're going to talk about the scope of the problem. First of all, harassment is alive and well today in 2016. We can see that in the number of complaints and the litigation costs made to the EEOC. The National Park Service also gives us a very strong example, and the medical field finds harassment alive and well, and there are new forms of harassment, such as harassment against LGBT employees. So what does harassment cost as far as the complaints? The report notes that last year alone, in 2015, there was $164.5 million in EEOC recoveries. That includes settlement and litigation. There have been untold psychological and health consequences to harassed workers, and company productivity, turnover, and reputation have been consistent and sometimes irreparable harm. So let's look a little bit more closely at the number of EEOC charges. What it amounts to, amazingly, is that the EEOC got an average of 76 harassment charges per day. And 28,000 of those harassment allegations were made against private and sector employers, and almost half of those involve sexual harassment. And you can see it's very clear on that chart that sex is way up there on the number. It's almost 50%. So it's no joke. If you just heard this thing in isolation, how many sexual harassments does it take to fire a federal worker? You might think you were hearing a variation of the light bulb joke. Unfortunately, that quote came from a congressional hearing just this June against the National Park Service, when their leadership was called up to account for why there has been a sexual harassment for so long and it's gone so unremedied. For example, in the National Park Service, there was a culture of sexual harassment which included a supervisor who was a ranger. I believe he was a chief ranger, and he took a a law enforcement employee, to a house of a volunteer, and with an excuse that they were helping this volunteer, and the house was empty, and he accosted her in the house. He also, besides sexually assaulting that employee, he also sexually solicited 2 others, and there was little done against him. In fact, Congress pointed out that the National Park Service leadership had been failing to respond to sexual harassment since at least the 1970s. So some people may think that high achievement is a panacea against sexual harassment, but that's not so. For example, a recent Journal of American Medical Association article, which was published in that journal, noted that 1/3 of female physician scientists reported sexual harassment in 2016. And the 66% of women experienced gender bias in an academic environment. The average age of the people who were surveyed in the study was about 43 years old, which meant they were only about halfway through their career. Finally, all the study participants were indeed high achievers. They had all previously received National Institute of Health Awards for career development. So sexual harassment is alive and well in the medical field. So large-scale studies and statistics can only tell part of the story. I'm going to look next at current case law, which indicates that the legal landscape is shifting. So what we're seeing is that current case law illustrates that the legal definition of harassment has been broadening. For example, it began with sexual harassment, as I mentioned, but now harassment liability can include any protected characteristics such as race or disability, national origin, etc. Additionally, sex harassment and discrimination is not just traditional gender discrimination or harassment. It can certainly include sexual orientation or transgender identity. So we're going to take a detailed look at that. Specifically, the EEOC has only recently been litigating sexual orientation discrimination cases, and the first one that they ever litigated has recently resulted in a $202,000 settlement against an employer. And they also have to hire a trainer who has expertise in LGBT issues. The EEOC claims that a lesbian employee was fired after she reported to management and, in fact, got on the hotline that was supposed to be for the purpose of reporting sexual harassment, to say that her supervisor had directed sexual gestures at her and made repeatedly harassing comments, which included, "I want to turn you back into a woman, and you would look good in a dress."
Yeah, I guess you don't need to be a lawyer, Steve, to recognize that that language is unacceptable.
Shoot, what am I going to do now?
No, you know, I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, you're right, and she was fired, Michele, within days after making her report. So you don't have to be a lawyer to figure that there might have been some retaliation there. So it's also important to note that there are some things that are not harassment. So just because the word harassment is used doesn't mean it's true. Employers need to always take allegations of harassment seriously, but they also need to document what they do and document discipline. So for example, harassment does not include disciplining an insubordinate employee for legitimate work-related reasons. In a recent case, there was a seasoned 67-year-old employee who wrote entries for example, like a cancer. It was in a publication for the medical field, and she had frivolously claimed that she was harassed every time she was disciplined. And this kept happening. So she was ultimately fired for insubordination, and of course, being a frivolous person, apparently, she sued. The employer, though, had taken good care to keep very good documents of the discipline, even long before she ever complained, and they gave her several chances to improve, and they have conducted a thorough investigation. Despite thinking that this might be frivolous, they were very careful and documented everything they did. So So don't be afraid to discipline your employees when you have legitimate business reasons to do so. But as we're going to discuss up next, documentation is important, but it's not the end of the story. Next, we're going to explore strategies and best practices for thwarting harassment. So on to part 3, which is strategies and best practices. So the report concludes various things that are consistent with the finding of experts that the company culture is a key to compliance. Training is important but can't stand alone. Training must reinforce company culture, and in fact it will, good or bad, and that empowerment at all levels of your organization will help prevent harassment. So jumping right in, does training prevent harassment? Well, there was some buzz around that maybe it doesn't anymore. For example, the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, published an article that made it look like the answer to that question that I pose above is no. The title was "No Evidence that Training Prevents Harassment, Finds EEOC Task Force." But the report is more nuanced than that. So the article is about the report, and what the report specifically says is that training alone will not prevent harassment. It says training should reinforce a culture of compliance, and that a holistic top-down commitment to root out harassment is the recommendation.
Which is what we have also been advocating for a long time, Steve.
Yeah, as far as I remember, before me, we certainly have been advocating that. And so a big important takeaway here is the culture is key. So a compliance can keep companies out of the legal and other hot water, and it can cultivate business success. Also, the report notes that a non-compliant workplace can have costs, which are, quote, the largest single component of the overall cost of sexual harassment. Additionally, failing to stop a high-performing harasser can result in net negative profit consequences. I'm going to stop for a minute here and let you know that we've got a link here to the Harvard study, which you can see in blue, from which this information came. It was in the report, but we also found the study. And basically, that study says that so-called toxic employees, even if they're very high-performing and seem to be super productive, actually because of all of the turnover costs, because of the lack of morale, because of all the various problems they cause on the workplace, they actually result in negative net profit consequences for employers. So if you're going to keep a toxic employer on board, you should do your best to make them non-toxic or let them go, is the takeaway. So here's another important thing that the EEOC recommends. You should identify situational risk factors. Now, what are those? And what does it mean? It means to be proactive in preventing harassment and maintaining what the report calls situational awareness. And this quote illustrates several of the risk factors, which we're going to go into in some amount of detail on the next screen. But before you get there, I'm going to just read the whole quote, which is, an employer noting surprise that women were being sexually assaulted on the night shift when they worked in isolation and their schedules were controlled by men is cold comfort to the victims of these assaults. So you're going to notice when we get to the next page that that women working the night shift, controlled by men, working in isolation, are some factors that need to be addressed by employers and should be noted. That's part of situational awareness.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Steve, because it seems by looking at the facts of the specific instance, the EEOC noted how they basically set these women up for being harassed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here I've written out all the risk factors so you can take a look and real quickly have a quick reference. But what I'd like to do is take a moment and look at where the report puts them all, which is it discusses them, but also compiles them all in Appendix C, which is a link to at the bottom here. And I'd like to actually go to that link you see that there's basically a chart here, or table, I guess is a better word, which has all the risk factors, indications that there's of the risk, why it's a risk factor, and some strategies for reducing harassment. I'm going to focus on just two of them and let you read this on your own later. So the first one is I'm going to look at the homogeneous workforce at the top. The EEOC points out that this means a historic lack of diversity, and currently only one minority is in the workforce, which could include the team or department or location. It's a risk factor because there could be a lot of pressure to these vulnerable persons. They may be perceived as different or other, or might just be uncomfortable. The strategies are to increase diversity at every level of the workforce and to pay attention to relationships even within those work groups. I'm going to also point out that if you go to the third factor on the chart, cultural and language differences in the workplace, we're talking about the opposite risk factor, which at first may seem counterintuitive. So homogeneity, lack of diversity, is fairly obvious, but diversity can be a risk factor if you have, for example, new employees with different cultural backgrounds, or maybe they don't know a lot about the law, what their rights are. They may be segregated among themselves, all people of one group working in one team or something like that. And the strategies include ensuring that, that they understand the laws, workplace norms, and policies. If possible, increase diversity. So try not to have all people on one team of one particular group, and pay attention to relationships. Just like in the other one for homogeneity, pay attention to relationships within your work groups. So I'll let you look at that in more detail on your own, and we'll go back to the slides now.
Okay, great.
All right, so our next one, next slide is going to talk about how everyone creates culture. So this is worth quoting. Organizational culture is one of the key drivers of harassment. So basically, the report says that if there's a culture that has zero tolerance of harassment, that needs to start at the top, but it still needs to be implemented at all levels. So again, as I said before, that's from the CEO down to the janitor. If there's a takeaway from this, is that these two sides of the coin, leadership and accountability, create an organization's culture. Leadership and accountability, two sides of one coin. So what's the role of leaders? We're going to obviously talk about both leadership and rank and file. Leaders should demonstrate a sense of urgency and commitment. They should communicate, and how they should do this is by communicating and modeling respectful behavior, having effective policies and procedures that they implement. They should have situational awareness. That's assessing and mitigating risk factors, which we talked about earlier. I'm going to skip this one and come back to it. I'm going to skip climate surveys for a second. They should devote sufficient money and time, so it's got to be in their budget to deal with harassment prevention. They have to have the time. If the workplace, for example, is so busy that somebody comes and says, I want to report harassment, and the supervisor says, let's meet next week, that's sending the wrong message. Wouldn't you say, McKinley?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And also, they need to ensure that anyone who is seeking to effect needed change needs to have the power and authority to implement that change. I want to stay on this slide for a minute and, in fact, link to the climate surveys here to talk a little about what they are and how they work. The University of Wisconsin has some climate survey tips. The whole report here is worth reading, but particularly I went right to page 12. And we're looking at the do's, which include things such as keeping data anonymous, but communicate the actions that you're going to take. It should involve a cross-section of employees. Also, an important point is, I think they mentioned it above. It's not actually in this do list, but they mentioned that it's not a report card. A climate survey is not a report card. It's basically an action item. It's a tool for cleaning up your workplace or finding out if your workplace needs cleaning up. So it needs to be followed by action. And then on the next page of this slide, there are a couple of don'ts, like survey without action, but I'm going to just go to the next page of this, not the slide, but the slide, yeah. So on the next page, there's some common at the top here, 7 survey sins, which could include surveying everyone instead of a sample, having a small size, or these probably are big ones, these last two, tying results to performance bonuses. So are you going to get honest results if you tie them to performance bonuses? Probably not. And if you just set arbitrary target numbers before you've even gotten information, you're compromising your data. So think about a well-designed tool.
Great. So collect the data, know your workplace, and then have some very defined and effective procedures in action to be following up with whatever incident comes up.
That's exactly right. And by the way, there's plenty of resources that employers can go to if they're not comfortable doing these surveys themselves.
Right.
So many ways of doing them. Yes. So I'd like to head on to our next slide here, which it talks about the role of systems in harassment prevention. So what are systems and what do they do? Basically, the point is to hold employees at all levels accountable. For example, the EEOC says there need to be reward systems where, somewhat counterintuitively again, in the beginning, more complaints, investigations, and disciplines may be a good sign, which might mean that the culture is changing. Maybe before people were afraid to report harassment. Maybe before investigations were slow to get started. Maybe not as many people are disciplined. All these things are part of one thing. So initially having all those things happen first can be good. On the other hand, you need a nuanced metric system to take account of evolving circumstances. As your culture improves, hopefully there will be fewer reports and fewer investigations and less discipline because they're improving, not because people are afraid to report or people are dragging their feet or whatever. So this, the EEOC kind of puts it all together by saying positive organizational change can be reflected in an initial increase of complaints, followed by a decrease in complaints and information about the lack of harassment derived from climate surveys.
Right. And so if you know, just to make an example, you're rolling out a climate survey to 3,000 employees and you have 0 reporting, that might be a red flag that survey wasn't very effective in you know, realizing your objectives.
Right, especially if the climate survey has people saying, I'm really worried about harassment, and then, you know, a month later you still have no reports. So let's talk about policy and procedure. I'm not going to go into detail on this again because of time constraints, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. Social media should be part of your policy and should be communicated. Policies need to be communicated in a variety of ways. They should include telling employees and actually having multifaceted reporting procedures. That's on the first column on one bullet point up from the bottom. For example, unfortunately, a common situation I've seen in litigation is that the only person to report to is the harassing supervisor. Probably not the best way to get reports, to get sexual harassment reported.
Yeah, that would be probably uncomfortable for the victim to have to report to her own harassment.
One could imagine retaliation as a result of that. So I'll let you read the rest of these on your own. Training reinforces culture. It's not the other way around. So it seems like a mistake that the EEOC is trying to point out is employers having a check the box approach. You know, that let's do training and let's hope that improves things. Well, you've got to work on your culture first, and then training needs to reinforce the existing culture. There's three kinds of trainings that the report recommends. It recommends anti-harassment training, workplace civility training, and bystander intervention, which I'll talk about in turn. I'm going to take a quick note to point out that these are all suggestions on the federal level, but not on some state levels. So, for example, although federal law does not require training, California, Connecticut, and Maine do, and California is a trendsetter, as we know. So, you know, there may be other states to follow, especially after this report is recommending training. And then I'm also going to mention that currently the EEOC can only require or enforce training if there's already been some litigation involved, and it can be part of a settlement or court award. So what is this anti-harassment training all about? So first of all, the report recommends that for all employees, you need to focus on behavior, not the legal standards. So we're talking about not just doing a check-the-box approach, not just having black-letter law. I mean, you're going to put your employees to sleep if you do that, right? So, so you're going to talk about what behavior not to do. And then you're going to be tailored to realistic situations from your workplace or organization or industry if possible. You need to clarify the types of conduct that are not harassment too, so that you don't get your people paranoid or resentful. What, I can't compliment anyone? You hear that often if people aren't trained or educated. So that's okay, or employers can't be made too nervous about disciplining people for legitimate business reasons. Also, got to explain how to report, what will happen after the report, and state that employees will not be retaliated against for reporting, and make sure all those things are true in your organization. So supervisors have additional training suggestions. So for example, send a clear message that they are accountable for harassment under their watch, communicate what they need to do, expected actions to prevent or stop harassment, explain that sometimes they have to report up the chain of command. So sometimes it's an HR problem. It's something the supervisors themselves can't handle or shouldn't handle. So explain what those are and when to do that and how to do it. And also, this is really important, there's an affirmative duty that must be communicated to respond to harassment that the supervisor or manager observes, even if no one complains. Don't wait for a complaint. Make sure that you're proactive and don't wait for someone to say I'm offended. If it seems like there's offensive behavior, take care of it.
Tackle it head on.
That's right. So here are some structural components that the report recommends. And it's, first of all, support needs to be at the highest level, and that's a credibility issue. So leaders should, for example, attend the program. If they just kind of walk in and walk out, what message does that send, right? And a nice thing, and this is what the EEOC considers a minimum, there should be at least like a video and a memo from the leader saying, I support this. Here's why this is important. The EEOC recommends that training should be regularly enforced and conducted. They say, and this is very interesting to us here at LawRoom, that it should be reinforced more than once a year. California law, for example, requires once every 2 years, and a lot of employers do the bare minimum under the law. But why not do it more often? It's recommended. They also recommend that it should not be the same each time. Make it dynamic in style, form, and content, and that's really no problem if you've got the right trainer. So other ideas are that I'm going to come back to the next bullet point and just point out that it should be routinely evaluated with feedback from everyone, from the rank and file employees, and based on the evaluation, whether it has changed behavior over time. Keep that in mind with your training. Do your climate surveys. And I'm going to skip back to the previous bullet point, which is that it should be conducted by live interactive trainers. I'm going to point out again, this is a suggestion. The EEOC can enforce this, but most of it is good suggestions with a slight quibble about the live aspects. So what they think live is going to accomplish, I think, is that it should be able to include examples and scenarios to play out and the ability to answer questions, and that it should be designed to be actively engaging. But the EEOC does allow, and let's go to the next slide, it does allow for one exception if live training is not plausible. they say here, I'm just quoting this whole thing, specifically the suggestion is that for some employers, providing live trainers will not be feasible because they are cost prohibitive or because employees are physically dispersed. In such cases, online or video-based training should still be tailored to specific workplaces and workforces and should be designed to include active engagement by participants. So we see where their emphasis is, and I think that's right. Active engagement, to have the ability to answer questions, to be workplace specific as possible.
Yeah.
So why is live training not for everyone? In my opinion, it's cost prohibitive for small companies, and for large companies, besides the cost issue, most of them are physically dispersed. It's really hard to train people all over the country, for example, and it's a huge headache to ensure that people are attending if you have any size of a workforce. So online training also is able to get past those problems and still do what the EEOC recommends. If you've got the right technology and staff, we can meet all the requirements, or any online trainer can meet all the requirements if they're up to snuff. And they can provide situational workplace-specific interactions. They can actively engage participants, and it's pretty easy to allow for timely answers to questions from qualified trainers via online training. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how Airbnb handled this, and we happen to know a little about them because we're proud to say that they're one of our clients. And so we know that they originally wanted online training, but they gave it some more thought, and they realized that live training wouldn't work for them. And so they went with online training because they were a 1,600 employee company. They're growing very, very fast, and they're located in multiple locations. And also they needed a centralized platform, and they needed a cultural fit tailored to their specific workforce. So hiring live trainers just wasn't going to work for them. They were going to have to go all over the place. They were going to have to keep attendance of, almost like, well, I was going to say almost 2,000 employees. Maybe it is by now. I don't know. They're growing pretty fast. And so they needed to be able to get questions answered very quick and not have trainers go back and forth and the logistical headaches that go with that.
Yeah, and I'm noting the cultural fit as well, tailored to the specific workforce that in Airbnb's case means a lot of millennials and a lot of tech-savvy millennials. So one of the challenges that a lot of employers have is, because we know we have to do training that looks good and it's engaging, like how do we engage millennials in this? And oftentimes high quality online training seems to be the answer to that.
Yeah, very good point. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how mandated training can be online training. And so all 3 states that mandate anti-harassment training permit, and in the case of California, seem to encourage online training. So specifically, California requires effective interactive training, and they specifically include in the definition online training. Connecticut permits online training. There was originally some doubt because the statute says that training must be provided in a classroom-like training. So some employers were writing letters, and the Connecticut Human Rights Organization decided to answer publicly in an informal opinion letter that question. They said specifically, classroom-like setting includes online training. So they clarified that for everyone in 2003 and haven't come back on it, never looked back. And Maine also allows online training. If you just check out the website, you go Maine training, you can find so many online trainers, and I'm sure they would have been shut down by now if that wasn't permitted in Maine, right? So that's all 3 mandated training states. So the EEOC recommends a couple of different kinds of training in addition to anti-harassment training. They recommend workplace civility training and bystander intervention training to help reinforce a culture of what they call respect, civility, and accountability on all levels. And so it's meant to complement and not replace anti-harassment training. So why do it? The EEOC report says that incivility is often an antecedent to workplace harassment, as it creates a climate of, quote, general derision and respect in which harassing behaviors are tolerated. The report also says uncivil behaviors can often spiral into harassing behaviors. So let's talk about this a little bit more and talk about what civility training accomplishes. So what is it going to accomplish? It's going to hopefully reduce bullying or conflict in the workplace, promote respect and civility, emphasize the positive, that is, the do's more than the don'ts, focus on the learner as an individual rather than what their class characteristics are or other social identity, avoid resistance that some people may perceive anti-harassment training to provoke. For example, groups that are perceived as more likely to be harassers or more likely to be victims. People sometimes have, whatever, reasonable or not, resistance, and so civility training can sort of bypass that. Finally, to emphasize a positive thing it does, it trains on interpersonal skills, conflict resolution, and supervisory techniques. Another kind of training that the EEOC recommends is bystander intervention training. It recommends training on how bystanders should appropriately intervene when they observe workplace harassment. I talked about this a little bit in terms of supervisors, how supervisors should jump in and be proactive if they observe harassment. The EEOC is going just a slight step further, not much further, but just a slight step further by saying everyone should be trained on how to intervene. And it is kind of an art to intervene. You don't just say, go intervene. That can be intimidating for people. So it needs training to increase their awareness of what to intervene on, to realize that it's a collective responsibility, to realize that everyone's empowered and need not feel passive in the face of a hostile work environment, for example. And also, what are your resources to seek help or to report misconduct? So that's part of bystander intervention. Maybe people don't feel comfortable saying, hey, you, stop that. Maybe they feel more comfortable, and maybe it's better in situations to report up the chain or to seek help. So all of that is part of bystander intervention training, ideally.
We see it in everyday life, Steve, right? When we see something wrong happen and people think somebody else is going to intervene, and it's because it's not easy. You need to be trained to be a proper bystander that can intervene to defuse a situation.
Yeah, that's right, Michaela. There have been studies, for example, mugging on the street, and if it's done in a crowded place, you'd think that it would be harder to get away with it, but sometimes no one will report, no one will call the police because they all think someone else will do it.
So be the bystander
right.
who intervene.
Exactly. So part of what bystander intervention is about is empowerment at all levels, but the EEOC goes even a little further than that and recommends that employers should adapt what's called an It's On Us campaign. The It's On Us campaign was originally put forward by the federal government in the context of campus sexual violence. And so the EEOC is saying, let's adapt that to harassment in the workplace. So specifically, the EEOC says the It's On Us campaign is premised on the idea that sexual assault, and I'm saying by extension sexual harassment, is not just about a victim and a perpetrator. It calls upon everyone to do his or her part, to be part of the solution. There are 3 pillars of the It's On Us campaign as it exists, and those can be adapted to anti-harassment efforts. Now, I'm going to just talk a little bit about sort of common sense because the EEOC report didn't really talk about how to do this, but one of the pillars is increasing bystander intervention, which we kind of already talked about. Second is defining consent, which I think deserves a little bit of talk, which is in the sexual assault context on campus, we're talking about what is consent to sex versus what is sexual assault. In the workplace, it seems fairly commonsensical that not everyone will say, I'm offended by that joke. Not everyone will say, stop asking me out on a date. But if it's a supervisor who keeps asking an employee on a date, they may not be consenting to it. They may not be consenting to listening to these off-color jokes all the time. So you've got to ask, is this objectively offensive, or is this objectively a problem? And finally, creating environments to support survivors is a term used in the sexual harassment context, but we'd say employee victims in this context probably, and otherwise we're talking about resources as we talked about before, how to report, what you do if somebody has been a victim. So they call adopting this an audacious goal to transform workplace harassment from being about targets, harassers, and legal compliance into one in which coworkers, supervisors, clients, and customers all have a role to play in stopping harassment. Everyone's empowered. Everyone's empowered to play a role in harassment prevention. I think we totally agree with that here at LawRoom.
Yes.
And so our question is, we feel we have a role, and we feel everyone has a role, so I'm just putting this out there. What's your role?
Great.
So to conclude, harassment remains a problem you can combat, but not by training alone. That would be the takeaway from the report. So in light of today's shifting legal landscape, the EEOC report reveals that harassment is still a major problem of liability. Training alone can't stop it. A holistic approach based on a reboot of workplace culture and shared responsibility is key, and that harassment prevention is on all of us.
Great. Steve, that was an awesome presentation. Absolutely. Thank you for presenting with us today. And I believe we give a very comprehensive overview of the workplace harassment landscape in 2016, as per the title. And in terms of trends and best practices also, I think that was a very great and cohesive analysis. To complete the analysis now, since we have a few minutes, I'd like to bring up a few questions that have been asked by our attendees today. And so we'll go through them, as many as we can, and then
sure. And then
we'll make the slides available for all of you folks. But one question that I liked that was asked was, we've said that training alone is not enough, right? We've heard that, the EEOC says it. Which among the other efforts indicated in the report is, in your opinion, experience, the one that is most effective, most complementary with training? Steve.
Okay, well, I would say that to me, commitment and accountability on all levels are a really key takeaway from the report and in life. From what I've seen, what I've observed in both my practice and as a researcher later on at LawRoom, I've seen that time and time again. And examples, I'll just point to some examples I brought up in the slides just to highlight. You can talk about a culture of allowing sexual harassment. We talk about the National Park Service. I mean, that was going on for well over 40 years, since the 1970s, this problem. And the leadership just wasn't taking charge of it. And I'd also point out that situational awareness is a big part of that commitment. For example, the knowledge that in the medical field, there's still so much sexual harassment. I think that really highlights that it's a male-dominated field still, and that there's probably not situational awareness of the risks of that kind of environment on an institutional level at most medical facilities that were under the study. I'll also point out that employers should just really make sure not to discourage reports. That's part of commitment and accountability. And the EEOC case with the $202,000 settlement against the lesbian employee is a real example of that. If you don't have accountability and commitment to a culture that is compliant, how easy is it for a supervisor to just terminate somebody after they've made a report, just like in that case.
Right. It's kind of ingrained in the process there, in the structure. Yeah.
Exactly.
So another question here that I liked was it seems like the EEOC recommendations for live training as the best practice would probably just apply to the small company with a lot of money. Is that correct? Is that what was your takeaway as well?
Yeah, that does seem to be the case, at least generally speaking. I can't speak for all training and all companies, but it is very costly from what I understand. For example, there aren't that many live trainers out there, so there's going to be a lot of competition, right? And it's a very specialized area. There are companies that's all they do. They're consultants and they train and they do workplace investigations. They offer a whole suite of services. Small companies are very unlikely to be able to afford that or to find good trainers out there who will do that. So yeah, I do generally agree with that statement.
And just as a nice segue to that is, what did the EEOC rely on when weighing live training versus online?
Michaela, I wish that I could answer that better. I really combed the footnotes to try to figure out where they had come up with that, and there's really nothing that says directly, here's our evidence, here's the data that supports live training. What I was able to find was that there were 2 large-scale studies done in the late 90s about training that are notated in that section, and there was a 2001 study of a university, a mid-sized university. And also there was some anecdotal testimony apparently, so that was part of, besides the studies that they looked at, there were testimonies by people like, for example, consultants in the field who did, I don't remember the name, but there was some company that was a consultant that actually did online training that was a company that gave testimony. So
they did live or online?
They seem to do online, from what I can tell.
Yeah, well, but judging from the dates, it seems like we're still in the era of DVDs, and we know how that will.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I'm going to keep going, right? Since we have time. This other question, it's about, again, the EEOC report saying workplace civility. It's a concept mentioned in the report. It makes great sense when you hear it, but are we looking at a whole new requirement here, or is the EEOC actually simply expanding on known principles?
I would say they're expanding on known principles. And I would say, is it a whole new kind of training? I think it really depends on whether your trainer is really, whether they're doing black letter law, whether they're doing the kind of training that the EEOC recommends against, or whether they're really a quality trainer. So quality trainers tend to put together a package where they will say, you're held to a higher standard. Here's the law, but here's some behaviors you should avoid. And many trainers will go beyond that in their training and already are addressing workplace civility, even if it's by another name. Like, for example, in California, employers are required to train on abusive practices. And if employers are putting that into the training already, I mean, trainers are already putting that, well, both, actually, into the training, then you're going to end up talking about things that are way beyond just the legal questions of anti-harassment. Also training that focuses, it's a change of emphasis. It's a change from do not behave badly to here are some things you should do. And so that's again going back to the higher standards. Just as a quick little plug, I'm proud to note that we do mention those higher standards in our training, right? And we talk about the shoulds. Okay. I'm doing that for a long time.
That's great, Steve. One last question here. It's a pretty long one. So between the EEOC claims and recent litigations you have followed, who in the corporate org chart would you say are the job functions most frequently exposed to liability charges? That is in case, obviously, there is a deficient the harassment prevention efforts were found to be deficient.
Mm-hmm. I would say, Michaela, that it's most often that the liability occurs on an organizational level, but it can occur on an individual level as well. But I would have to make a distinction between federal and California law. On the federal level, you can't, it's vicarious liability, which means, let me just unpack the legal jargon there. That means that that an employer, that is the organization, is on the hook for the acts of the individual employees, unless you've got something like criminal behavior, criminal assault. But importantly, California is different. California allows anyone who is a supervisor to be held individually liable, and that I think addresses your question the most directly. And a supervisor, I've seen a case where a supervisor has been found to be a CEO, where that person had hiring or firing authority against an employer. So as long as they can take tangible employment acts, that person can be liable. So those would be the situations in which an individual on the org chart could be found liable, at least under California law. That make sense?
Great, yes. And thank you for answering all those questions, Steve. That was great. Our time here today is almost up, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. But sure. that was outstanding. I think between the presentation and the questions, it was very, very comprehensive.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed this.
So to all our attendees, I want to let you know that we'll make the slides available for you. We'll send them in the follow-up email along with the recording. So not only are you going to be able to access Steve's presentation slides from today, but as you've seen, he's embedded throughout the presentation linked to resources that he's referenced and quoted, and to kind of build this bigger picture of what the EEOC report looked at, and also what Steve looked at in his research. So that will be available for you along with the recording as usual. Lastly, I want to say one last thing for those of you who are listening to us today but have not yet had a chance to take a look at our training. If you would like to receive a demo of our courses and online training platform, all you got to do is type in the question box at the right-hand side again, the bubble, that is the speech bubble with a question mark. Just type in there the word demo, and we'll make sure that somebody from our team reaches out to you, and one of our training experts will show you around, show you some coursework, and show you the platform. I'd say our time is basically up, so thanks to all of you for being with us. We hope you enjoyed the event, and there will be many more to come, so stay tuned, and thanks for being with LawRoom today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Steve again. Okay? Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.